This presentation is brought to you by Homeschoolers of Maine, also known as HOME. HOME's mission is to preserve, protect, and promote homeschooling in Maine, and has been offering guidance and support to homeschool families since 1990. The origin of Maine's homeschool law dates back to 1979. Several families that year wanted to educate their children at home and approached the Maine Department of Education to create guidelines for homeschool approval. Under the compulsory attendance law then, school boards approved individual homeschooling programs. Each district set up its own requirements, but school boards often denied approval simply because they were philosophically opposed to home education. Families had to provide their curriculum and answer questions in public open session of the school board, often with the media present. In 1984, statewide homeschooling rules were promulgated by the Maine Department of Education. An application and complete curriculum outline were required, and families still had to receive approval from the local school board. By the late 1990s, the application process was shortened, and approval reverted solely to the Maine Department of Education. Through the years, many homeschool pioneers, Homeschoolers of Maine, and HSLDA have fought various restrictive legislative bills directed toward homeschoolers. There were bills that, if passed, would have required homeschool parents to be certified teachers, to use the learning results, and to take the public school's state assessment test, to homeschool for a full year at age 16 or older before they could get a driver's license, and required monthly visits from school officials. The current law replacing the approval requirement with the notice of intent to homeschool finally passed the legislature in 2003. Making it the least restrictive law since 1979. We urge you to continue to learn more about the importance and value in protecting our hard-won freedom to homeschool. Homeschoolers in Maine can point you towards many resources to help. We are here today to take a look at the question, is school choice and its funding really a choice? Thank you for stopping by to learn how ESAs, education savings accounts, and other public and government funding of education can have a negative impact on homeschoolers. So let's begin with the question, what is an ESA? An ESA is an education savings or scholarship account. It is a method of funding education with government money. UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, according to their quality and inclusive education for all goal, would allow for government control of every educational option through regulations and accountability measures tied to public funding. Simply put, what the government funds, the government controls and regulates. Any homeschool that receives government funds will be co-teaching with the government. It's important to also look at what an ESA is not. ESAs are not an ideal that aligns with education liberty. Parents have the right to educate their children at home without help, influence, or excessive regulation from government. ESAs work against a limited government model. Education savings accounts, or ESAs, create new law and expand the Department of Education by providing them with new duties, thus expanding and not limiting government. ESAs do not promote parental rights and responsibilities in education. When homeschoolers take taxpayer money to educate their children at home, the lines become blurry as accountability to taxpayers creates a system requiring students to be educated to the satisfaction of the government, not the parent. ESAs create an ever-expanding monopoly, entangling private and homeschools under the control of the single system that funds them. While we appreciate the desire to help more parents afford private and home education, we hold a vastly different opinion on how to achieve this goal. ESAs place an enormous amount of misguided trust in the government. Now, here's an important question. Do ESA students get cash? Homeschooled ESA students are not given cash, but rather access to purchase approved materials from approved providers. Once the agency approves an application, the state awards the family a digital bank account that can only be used for eligible educational expenses. ESA's families usually receive a debit card to make their purchases, but some parents, such as in Arizona, have misused these cards. An important thing to note here is the idea of approved materials and approved providers. This really limits the access that homeschooled students using ESAs would have to provide materials for their students that meet with their own educational goals and desires. So the question, what does school choice really mean? ESA legislation does not provide a single new educational choice, nor does it broaden any of the rights associated with such choices. It does, however, significantly alter the choices and freedom of those who choose to accept ESA funding. ESA legislation is actually not about school choice at all. It is about school choice funding. Parents, especially homeschool parents, have chosen their education method, and they have made that choice knowing that it means they are financially responsible for the bills associated with that choice. ESAs do nothing to address the increasing cost of education, the record of poor outcomes, or any of the other problems that plague public schools. Do ESAs fund students, not systems? In reference to parents pulling students from public schools with questionable morals, it was said that the proposed solution would, in essence, place all students, public, private, parochial, and homeschooled, into one system, a funded system. A system that would still be funded and controlled by the government. A homeschooled student who is enrolled in an ESA becomes a part of the system, and this results in the loss of parental control through regulations. The government simply must control everything that it funds, without exception. Is it really my tax money? Tax dollars have never been designated for personal, private use. Once taxes leave my hands, they stop being my tax money. When a homeschool family applies for an ESA, they increase the school district's tax revenue. More students mean more taxes will have to be levied to pay for additional private and homeschool students. This not only grows the government, but raises property tax bills as well. Are home educators taxed twice? Homeschoolers have voluntarily chosen to homeschool. They took on this responsibility. They would have to pay school taxes even if they didn't have children, just like retirees continue to pay taxes when their children are grown and gone. It is important to understand that if we choose to enroll our children in a publicly funded ESA program, we will have to follow the program's rules and the program schedule. By doing so, we would have a limited choice on the curriculum used and the method of instruction. We cannot take the free education and keep the control. Do ESAs data mine? Yes, it is crucial for their perceived success. Every child enrolled in the public school is put into the longitudinal database connected with P21 and Common Core. This allows the education system to collect up to 400 different data points on each child. These may be shared among state agencies without parents' knowledge or consent. The P21 framework is a model for incorporating 21st century skills into learning. These literacies are translated into a list of competencies that it is supposed students should master by the time they leave school. These competencies measure the outcomes of student learning. Do ESAs require transformative social and emotional learning? CASEL, which stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, is working towards states having a shared goal to connect education and workforce policy through a social emotional learning lens. Their definition of social emotional learning has changed since 2020. The SEL, or social emotional learning approach, usurps the role of parents in domains traditionally belonging to parents. An SEL approach requires academics to take a back seat to modern progressive theories that are counterproductive and undermine academic learning. Homeschools that receive ESA funding will be required to teach SEL subjects in order for the students to take the required state assessment. Can private homeschools opt out? ESA proponents suggest that homeschoolers who don't want to take ESA money will not be forced to participate. While true on the surface, this evasive response is misleading at best. Most ESA bills do not distinguish between funded and unfunded homeschools. This means that the regulations which must be heaped upon the funded will also fall upon those who do not take the money. Passage of the ESA legislation is a backward step for homeschoolers. Do ESAs help special needs students? Families with special needs students who apply for ESAs will find that their ESA funding may not cover all of the expense of therapies, tutors, and assessments that their student may require. In Arizona, where ESA funding first became available only for special needs students in 2015, it became a way for public schools to offload their expensive IEP, or Individualized Educational Program, students. Once a parent committed to accepting ESA funding for a school year, they could not receive any therapy, classes, or assistance from their district public school for that year. Many special needs parents were unable to afford the cost of therapy and tutoring and were unable to help their students on their own. Do ESAs impact co-ops? The richly rewarding homeschool tradition of co-op classes and activities will be severely damaged when the parents who normally volunteer to teach a low-cost class will be shunted aside for expensive ESA-funded tutors and activities. Will ESAs help low-income families to homeschool? This is the ultimate question. And the answer is that ESAs alone simply do not provide enough money for a parent to stay home to homeschool. As has happened with college education, middle and low-income families will be squeezed out of private school and homeschool participation due to the inflated prices that will result from the infusion of government cash. Will ESAs let more students escape failing public schools? Statistically, a low-income or middle-class family who was unable to afford home or private school before the passage of ESA legislation is still unable to afford them after ESA passage. Because ESA legislation seeks to unite all forms of education into one system, there is no appreciable difference between forms. It truly represents an education monopoly where one size must fit all. Freedom and success are not gained by trapping more students in the system. In fact, ESAs create a greater number of cellmates. Will a free market improve education choices for students? The right answer is not to reduce choices by bringing all choices under one funding umbrella. The right answer is to let the free market do what it does best, thrive through innovation. We welcome your comments, questions, and feedback via email or phone. It is imperative that homeschoolers are explicitly excluded from any public or government funding of education. On behalf of homeschoolers of Maine and homeschool families across our state, we thank you for your support.